Peter, Prince of the Apostles, founder of the Church of Rome, and first Pope. Well, maybe, or maybe not. Perhaps Peter never went to Rome. Perhaps Peter never left the Eastern Roman Empire, as many Christians themselves claim. Or perhaps Peter is a fabrication like the rest of the disciples of Jesus. Certainly, there can be no doubt that in the New Testament story, Peter often speaks for the 12, that he is the first mentioned of Jesus' inner circle, along with James and John, that witness many key episodes. Peter is brought to the fore a number of times, whether to himself walk on water, or to deny knowing Christ 3 times. The curiosity is that the New Testament has nothing to say regarding the subsequent fate of Peter. It doesn't even hint that he may have gone to Rome, as it does with Paul, but drops Peter with the comment, "He went to another place," in Acts 12. Frustrated Christians filled the silence of the Gospels with additional stories of their own. Peter, it seems, had gone to Rome where Mark recorded his teachings and thus produced what's known as Mark's Gospel. Acts of Peter recorded the epic story of Simon Magos, who performed magic before Nero. The flying magician had been brought down by Peter's prayers. And in a celebrated story of Peter's martyrdom, the apostle had sought to flee Rome but encountered Christ on the way and returned to face his fate. But let's leave silly stories for simple folk to one side for a minute and consider the city to which Peter was said to have gone, Nero's Rome. The city was growing rapidly and now spread beyond the Republican walls, particularly to the northwest and the Field of Mars. Further on, across the river, was hilly ground noted for its poor quality wine. Here passed the Via Cornelia, which, in common with other roads leading from the city, was lined with graves. In fact, it appears that much of the Vatican Hill was a cemetery, the closest available to the city. The lower slopes were set out as gardens by the mother of Nero, Agrippina. The teenage Nero had less interest in gardens than chariot racing, so he restored the circus built by his uncle Caligula. It's unclear how far the circus was monumentalised, but it became a venue for the Neronian Games, initiated by Nero in the year 66 and intended by the emperor to be held every 4 years. On the northern flank of the circus and further up the hill was the Vatican Phrygianum, a shrine to the cult of Attis and Cybele, an early-day version of the Jesus and Mary cult. Well, Nero died while still a young man, and his name became a byword for debauchery, cruelty, and excess. But was he really so bad? Most emperors killed members of their own family. In part, the notoriety of Nero was a consequence of historians who were beholden to the new regime, the Flavians. Nero was the last of the Julio-Claudians, and the fall of the old regime needed justification and purpose. But also the infamy that attaches to the name of Nero owes a great deal to the foundation myth of a novel religious cult. In truth, nobody knows who founded the church in Rome. In its very earliest form, the church had no centralised authority, no agreed doctrine, only certain radical ideas relating to the Christ as God's agent in the world. It was indistinguishable from the Jewish community from which it emerged. We will save consideration of the notorious passage in Tacitus, in which he describes the tortures supposedly inflicted on Christians, for another day. But as it would later be claimed that Peter was among them, just reflect on these questions. Would the executioners of the leader of a hated sect judged guilty of arson, for which the ancient laws required burning, really have agreed to any request for a particular style of execution? Yet tradition tells us that Peter requested crucifixion like his Lord, but upside down. Would the executioners really have handed over the remains for burial? And if a vast multitude had perished for admitting to being a Christian, would any Christian remain willing to claim the body? Tacitus is a well-respected historian, but it is curious that no Christian writer, not even Tertullian, refers to the burning of the Christians for centuries. And in fact, Christian tradition cannot decide whether Peter met his end in the year 64 or in the year 67, when he supposedly died on the same day as Paul. In fact, the profusion of traditions relating to Peter, most of which originated in the last quarter of the 2nd century, suggests a determined effort to fill a void. It all rather adds up not to a unique and historical event occurring in one place at one time, but to an attempt to retrofit into a coherent tale incompatible and fraudulent claims made at different times and places. In the middle years of the 2nd century, as conflicting teachers strove to speak for true Christianity, a tighter, more disciplined structure arose among one particular group. Greek missions to the city gradually lost out to a Catholic element which stressed apostolic authority. Peter's death was associated now with a persecution that had followed the fire of Rome. His death had Romanized this Jew from Judea. His was an authority to silence innovators. Well, none of this mattered for more than a century, but then a religious revolution occurred which changed everything. It involved a certain warlord called Constantine, a bridge near Rome, and the defeat of an emperor called Maxentius. In October 312, Constantine entered Rome for the first time. He wasn't especially interested in the city, but took pains to relabel the building achievements of Maxentius for himself. Into the Basilica of Maxentius, Constantine placed a 40-foot seated figure of himself. The Praetorian Guard, who had proclaimed Maxentius 6 years earlier, were disbanded. So too were the Imperial Horse Guard, and their barracks redeveloped into the Lateran Basilica. The neighbouring palace, which had belonged to Constantine's former wife, the sister of Maxentius, he gave to Pope Miltiades. He then returned to Gaul. Now this is where it gets really interesting. Miltiades died and was replaced by Sylvester, who remained Pope more than 20 years, almost the entirety of Constantine's reign. Yet of Sylvester's life we know virtually nothing. Nothing, that is, apart from the most extraordinary forgery concocted in the 8th century to justify and legitimize papal power, the donation of Constantine. What is clear is that Constantine had little time for Rome or its bishop, and his spiritual advisor was Hosius of Cordova. The Basilica of St. Peter, far from being a pet project of Constantine, was left to Sylvester to manage and took 30 years to complete. Its location on a hillside outside of the city, though appearing to honour the grave of Peter, owed much to the availability of space in a city that had been honouring pagan deities for 1,000 years. It was essentially a 5-aisled basilica with the addition of a transept. A vast quantity of soil had to be moved to create a level platform before construction could begin. In the process, the pagan tombs that lined the Via Cornelia were buried and reused as structural support. The neighbouring cult shrine of Attis Cybele, though interrupted by the construction work, still managed to continue. The Basilica Church, built in Constantine's name, surprising as it may seem, had no permanent altar. The building was used mainly for celebrating the dead, buried in its floor, and not for liturgical use. Eating and drinking in the nave often became disorderly. A focal point was a box-like marble and porphyry cenotaph which commemorated the martyrdom of Peter. Constantine sent a gift of twisted columns pillaged from a temple of Apollo in Asia Minor, and they were added to hold up a canopy. It can be reconstructed from the image found on a small 5th century reliquary found in Croatia in 1908, the Polar casket. Old St. Peter's survived for 1,000 years, though was much altered and repaired. Gregory I ordered the most radical change, raising the pavement around the cenotaph several feet in order to place an altar directly over the Constantinian memorial, and at the same time over the supposed grave of Peter. The raised presbytery also separated the clergy from the laity. The old basilica withstood the ravages of centuries, including occupation by Saracen invaders in the 9th century, who stormed the church and carted off its treasures. The basilica was finally torn down in the 16th century, and all the while the secret of St. Peter was protected by a curse. But then we entered the modern era and a slightly more worldly curiosity. Pius XII began the process of validating uninterrupted tradition of Peter's gravesite during the war years. He worked closely with a German colleague from the 1930s, Ludwig Cass, erstwhile leader of the Catholic Centre Party. Reichstag member Cass voted for the enabling act that gave Hitler dictatorial power in 1933, and the next day he left Germany to take up a post in the Vatican. Pacelli became Pope and Cass led the team that would secretly explore the ground below the high altar. Cass wasn't, of course, an archaeologist, and the archaeologists who did the digging were certainly passionate Catholics. It had long been suspected that the Vatican stood above an extensive graveyard, but now there could be no doubt. Running east-west was a series of elaborate tombs dating from the 2nd and 3rd centuries. As the excavation continued, more and more tombs were revealed. It became clear that there were 3 distinct levels. The crypt of St. Peter's preserved something of the original basilica, but below that, and not far beneath its floor, was a pre-Christian necropolis. It was a tremendous discovery. The 4th century church had inadvertently preserved its pagan predecessor. The excavation continued in secret throughout the war and beyond. Under some difficulty, the excavators approached the area that most concerned them, that is, the area immediately below the high altar. As they worked their way through the alphabet of tombs, the excavators identified a room-sized area which they called P, in which were much simpler burials, but nothing that suggested the graves were Christian. But then came the discovery of colonnettes within the jumble of centuries of building material, which prompted the speculation that the trophy of Gaius had been found. Now, Gaius was a churchman around the year 200, and his words were recorded by Eusebius more than 100 years later. The identification of the trophy was too good to miss. And if the trophy meant not simply a memorial but an actual grave, then this was pay dirt, the grave of Peter. Within the box-shaped cenotaph built by Constantine, still visible in reconstruction from the Clementine Chapel, was, it seemed, the trophy of Gaius, hidden from view by today's niche of the Palea. Below must surely be the bones of the blessed saint. Well, sadly for the excavators, they were not. They had dug their way around various sarcophagi and simple graves only to discover an empty trench about 1 metre square. Directly beneath the supposed trophy of Gaius, the void had had some purpose. It was sealed by a slab taken from a pagan tomb, into which was punched a hole, giving access to a small opening in the floor of the trophy above. Disappointed with the empty grave, the excavators dug lower, revealing an irregular edge to a wall dubbed the Red Wall for its surface coloration, and here they collected fragments of bone. They passed the fragments on to the Pope. His physician said that they were the bones of an elderly man of robust build, and the fragments were stored away. It was enough for the Pope. The Jubilee year of 1950 ended with Pius optimistically announcing that beyond all doubt the tomb of Peter had been found. But it was a bluff. The excavators finally published their report in 1951, and the archaeologists reported no trace of Peter. Not one inscription, just an empty cavity. But then again, more than 1,000 coins in the soil below the so-called grave, and a rather attractive gold votive offering that had been wedged in the sidewall. Well, at this point, a real hero of Catholicism entered the story, Margherita Guarducci. They always say if you want a different opinion, you should ask a different expert. Guarducci was apparently uniquely gifted with the ability to interpret minuscule ancient graffiti, which other people saw as meaningless scratches. She was also a friend of the Pope and determined to defend the certainties of her faith. She began by devoting a year of study to a graffito of 2 crudely etched figures that defaced a god in one of the pagan tombs. It was handiwork that could only have been done after the tombs had lost their roofs. The barely visible heads could have been anybody, but to Guarducci they were Peter and Christ, confirmed, so she maintained, by an ungrammatical prayer, not only mentioning Peter's name, but the presence nearby of his body. The original investigators had thought the lettering, if indeed it was lettering, too obscure, but Guarducci was in no doubt, and soon the graffito faded from view. Guarducci, with the support of Pope Paul VI, next turned her attention to the trophy and the adjoining wall, which had been dubbed the graffiti wall. Here were hundreds of scratches, often in overlapping confusion. It was dated to the late 3rd or early 4th century, and was evidently Christian by its frequent use of the Cairo monogram. The wall had been entombed by the construction of the Constantinian cenotaph. Could the graffiti wall in fact be the trophy spoken of by Gaius? Yet still nothing referred to Peter. Miss Guarducci began a 20-year campaign to prove that the original archaeologists had made serious errors and had missed vital evidence. Where the original investigators read names and simple prayers on the graffiti wall, Guarducci saw a complex mystic cryptography, revealing that not just Peter, but Christ and Mary were venerated numerous times, and complex liturgical formulas were invoked. Rather weakening her case was the fact that graffiti of the same period is to be found across town in the catacombs of St. Sebastian. And these do not invoke mystic cryptography and do mention the apostle by name. An oddity of the graffiti wall is that it has a receptacle cut into its surface, a marble-lined box, and designed for holding something special. And this is where the story gets quite bizarre. According to the original investigation team, when first discovered, this receptacle was empty, but Garducci alleged that it had contained bones, that they had been removed secretly at night by Ludwig Cass. Cass was now dead, but apparently a workman had helped in the removal, and now, 10 years later, remembered the night and promptly produced the bones from a storeroom. Garducci arranged for the bones to be tested, and this time around there was no confusion of individuals and animals, and the bones again were identified as of an elderly man of robust build. A further twist to the story is that Father Ferrua, head of the original team, while savagely critical of Garducci, himself had taken home a tiny fragment of plaster said to have fallen from the wall and into the receptacle. Just discernible on this fragment were some Greek letters, well, possibly so. It is just as likely that the letters read Peter is not here as Peter is here, or that they are not letters at all. Would letters less than 7 millimeters high have been scratched on a wall barely a metre from the ground? Ferrua himself did not even mention the tiny fragment in the official report. But Garducci seized upon the find as critical evidence. On such a flimsy basis were Peter's bones identified. Paul VI claimed that Peter's remains had been identified in a way that we consider convincing, and the fragments of bone were shown to the public for the first and last time by Pope Francis in 2013 at the close of the Year of Faith. The relics were returned to their purported finding place in the graffiti wall. How they ever got there from the supposed grave was never adequately explained. With faith, a divine mystery is explanation enough. But it isn't history, it isn't true, it's just more astounding rubbish.